Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming live at you again for another Film Fanatic show. It is Thursday morning at 10:18. Another beautiful day. It's one thing. The world might be burning down around us, but it's weather's been pretty sweet. So, yeah, it's been crazy times we are living in. So I don't usually do too many like political rants or shows here, but sometimes things just are just so unbelievable. Recently, I just saw yesterday, and I think the situation of kind of what's been happening is going to affect what we do as artists. Whether it's like small potatoes artists like myself or big potato artists. Like shit. It could be anyone from like any pop star to what have you. Anybody basically in the arts. With just saw recently, last night, yesterday, that Jimmy Kimmel from one of the late night talk show hosts has basically been suspended. His show has been temporarily shut down, and it sounds like his show is going to be uh, erased, and his show might be canceled, and he might get fired. And it's pretty horrifying when you have the FCC going out of their way, and of course Trump has got all of his cronies to, you know, he systematically has like elected the officials that he believes in, that share his totalitarian beliefs, and now the FCC is like getting involved with mudslinging and politics, and and basically it's a domino. It's going to cause this domino effect. You know, a lot of people like to use this word of cancel culture and all of this bullshit. That's really just kind of ridiculous, and unfortunately, it's always used by kind of the right wing movement, that the left is responsible for cancel culture. And when it comes down to it, uh, the right wing, every chance they get, they want to use their Christian ideals, and there's no separation of church and state. You know, our our founding fathers, when the United States was born, and how it the seeds were planted for true democracy. Our forefathers escaped Europe, escaped England to escape the tyranny of a king, and to hopefully strive and to live in a free society, where there is democracy and and a clear balance with, and a distinction between, religious ideology and political thought and laws that are put into place, and that the power of the king could be rebuked, and that it would be disposed of, because having the sole power controlled by one entity is always a dangerous thing. And it's tyranny. It's not democracy. It's oppression. And that's essentially, I think in a nutshell, why our once great country was formed. And here we are now. So When you think of what happened with was just yesterday with Jimmy Kimmel and then Stephen Colbert, two late night talk show hosts who honestly I grew up watching you know uh, late night talk shows. I was at the tail end of David Letterman. I used to watch Conan O'Brien all the time as a kid. High school, I used to always watch Conan O'Brien. Tom Snyder. I mean, I was a product of that, and it was a lot of and then the old school SNL, and satire and comedy, and basically that was a part of my life and a part of many millions and millions of people growing up across the world. And when you look at comedians like Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, they've made their careers out of making fun of uh, political figures and all of the bullshit that entails, whether they're Democratic or Republican or independent or libertarian, it doesn't matter. That was their job, and that's always been their job to make light of these horrific things and events that happen, but also maybe make you kind of question certain things. But that's their job. That's their they were always focusing and doing the same thing. If you trace back Stephen Colbert's career from The Daily Show to 20 years ago to now, and the same thing with Jimmy Kimmel, any comedian. I mean, there's always politics has always been this uh, source of an endless amount of comedy that could be written about it because of just how insane and just how incredibly ridiculous it is, and the incompetence that happens. So it's always been, especially with those two figures, they've made a living doing that for years. And I don't really watch late night shows anymore, late night talk shows anymore, because I just don't really. I've moved on to other things. Like I spend most of my time watching movies and things like that. That to me, that's when it comes to media. That's how I get my entertainment. And generally don't really think. I feel like the art of the interview has been dead. Interviews aren't really interviews anymore. When a lot of these talk show hosts have guests on their show, to me it's just a lot of bullshit, and like they're just there to sell a product. You don't learn anything new. There's not an actual like discussion about anything. And that's just my own personal view. But yet they do what they do, and they have the right to do what they do. And I feel like when you watch the old Johnny Carson show, I feel like there were moments, and there some classic interviews where people were actually being kind of intelligently interviewed, and you would learn something, but they were very entertaining. But in the end of the day, it's comedy, and politics has always been a major component of that. And so now the FCC has, we of course, all of these, there's been a war declared on freedom of thought, freedom of speech, where you have all of these departments, colleges being threatened, and programs being defunded, NPR being defunded, um, PBS being defunded because of liberal views. Um, we're living in an unprecedented time of history that I think is truly terrifying, and this domino effect to see where it's going to go is pretty scary. And now that Jimmy Kimmel essentially has gotten fired for doing his job and being a comedian is just unbelievable. And well, I can't even saying unbelievable isn't doing it justice in any way, shape, or form. And then also Stephen Colbert being terminated. He's got one more year left on his contract. And it's all due to the right wing movement that has kind of taken over and usurped this republic. So good luck with that. People who want to support this true movement of cancel culture. Anyway, enough of this bullshit or that bullshit. So, uh, today's on a show on a movie that I think I did a show on a while ago, but I'm not sure. So I try to keep track of movies that I cover and talk about. I have done multiple shows on certain movies that I just really really love, and and again, I think it's like I think good movies for me are it's like that kind of that that's the it ages like I look at a great movie as like fine wine, like it ages and with time, and I think it like certain things in art that you might always go back to, whether it's that particular album or a particular movie or even a painting or an artist, like you'll always go back to their work and you get different feelings from it. You get different interpretations, different ideas because it's the source of continuous inspiration. So that when I revisit movies and talk about movies again, especially movies that I really love, um, that's usually what it is for me because I feel like if I see say for instance one example would be one of my all time favorite movies of all time, probably my favorite Lucio Fulci movie, House by the Cemetery. I've done a few shows on that movie, and then another movie, Tourist Trap by Chuck Connors. I've seen those movies so many times, and then so many times where I couldn't give you a number, but I've seen them in every stage of my life. Whether I was a kid or a teenager, high school, or now an old fart. So, and again, my perspective changes each time, and I get something new out of it. So, and I look at that as being kind of that, it ages like fine wine, that kind of idea. So, when I talk about a movie, different phases, that's kind of, the method to my madness, I guess. But anyway, today is on a movie that is, I don't know. Again, I think I did a show on this movie before, and my perspective has changed on this movie. But then at the same time, when I really think about it, kind of hasn't. It really hasn't. And that is, and I have this on DVD. And the reason I'm talking about this movie again, and I'm only saying that if I did do a show, because I might have done a show on this, but sometimes I lose track. But recently, there's a YouTube guy that I really love who did a show on this movie that I'm going to talk about, 42nd Street Forever. He's a amazing. He's got an amazing channel, and it's all like grindhouse movies. And he grew up. This guy grew up in New York City during the 70s and in the 80s. He was in New York. He experienced all of the grindhouse cinema. He was there, and so he shares all of his thoughts during of that time, and also all of the movies that were coming out and how the world was a very different place and cinema was a very different. Cinema itself was also in a very different place. So it's awesome, and I've always jokingly said, but it's actually true that if I had a time machine and there and a time machine actually existed, the time I would go back to and try to live in or visit would be New York City on 42nd Street in like the late 70s to the 80s during the grindhouse decades, and been there for that without a doubt. But anyway, he talks he does a lot of shows mainly on a lot of those older films. but he does do some new shows. And so he did this show recently on a movie, on this movie, and he was like kind of really raving about it. It was a real short video. And I was like, at first, I was like, huh, okay. I was surprised because a lot of the stuff that he reviews is all like old shit. So I was surprised that he did something more recent. But again, he covers all kinds of movies, but it's mainly Grindhouse movies. And so he was talking about this movie that's a more recent film, and he was saying how it's just one of the greatest vampire movies ever made. And I was like, you know what? Oh, okay, yeah, I've seen it quite a few times. I haven't seen it in a really really long time. Um, I I do own it, and I was like, you know what? Maybe I'll watch it. So I watched it last night, and that is 30 Days of Night with Josh Hartman. This Josh, sorry, Josh Barnett, I believe is his name. Let me get his name right here. Josh Hartnett, who I do like a lot as an actor. He's been in some really cool movies, and he's kind of been coming back in more recent films. But I generally have always liked him. But this movie, 30 Days of Night, I have this on DVD. This is a pretty good copy. It's got a lot of special features on here, which is cool. Um, and I saw this movie. I don't know. I kind of have a long history with this movie. I saw this movie in the theater. Came out in 2007, so quite a few years ago. Um, so it's hard to believe it's been that long. But I bought this version, this DVD copy, quite a few years ago. I've had this for quite a few years, and I've actually seen this movie quite a few times. And you know, it's a pretty good. There's a pretty good cast in this film. I particularly like um, Danny Danny Houston, who plays Marlowe, who is like the head vampire movie. And this film is the story. The movie itself is based on a graphic novel, 30 Days of Night. And the premise of this movie is really awesome. It's got some really good things about it. The premise is takes place in this winter town in Alaska, I believe, where there's this town that literally has the sun goes away for 30 days, and the this clan or gang of vampires move into this town and just feast on everyone there, and everyone all of the people that live there are completely helpless, and there's no way they can escape. So when you think of that premise, that's kind of awesome. It is something we've never really seen before in a movie. And again, this was based on a comic book graphic novel quite a few years ago. And um, I've always thought this movie was, well, honestly, I've always thought this movie was, it's okay. It's got some really good attributes. I think the cast is pretty good. I think it's pretty well directed. I think the atmosphere is pretty good. Um, and I think it's, as far as the gore factor, the horror elements, it's pretty gory. It's pretty brutal. Ben Foster is in this film, who plays this character that he essentially plays a Renfield character. He's this human who does the bidding, who is being somewhat held captive by the vampires, but he's essentially promised eternal life if he does uh, if he listens to to his orders given by the vampires. You know, essentially a character we've seen a lot before. Um, you know, Renfield, of course, Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's essentially the same thing. But, and again, the movie has some good suspense. The premise is really great. The idea, the concept is really fantastic. And I watched this movie last night, and I have to say, I didn't get all the way through it. You know, the Ben Foster is such a great actor, and we see him. We're introduced to him in the beginning, and it's kind of a play on the whole Renfield thing. You know, taken from Dracula, which is cool. But it's also there's something about it where it's kind of predictable, but it's good. And Ben Foster is such an amazing actor, and I like that kind of the way they kind of introduce the story or the way they bring it, you know, into you know they the way they introduce the story and how it unfolds. Um, but the thing I have to say, I didn't get all the way through this movie, and I have to say, I think I enjoyed this movie. For me, this movie hasn't aged well, uh, and I couldn't get all the way through it. I got this movie's about 2 hours, and I got about an hour and 40 minutes into it, and finally I was like, I just felt tired and exhausted. And I think the reason is when I think about it, it's like I think there's a good, obviously a really good story. I think the premise is kind of fantastic. The direction is pretty good. There's a good solid cast. It's got pretty good atmosphere. Um, but ultimately, the thing that drove me nuts about this movie is the actual vampire design and the editing for this film. Um, to me, it really reminds me of like a Danny Boyle, like a 28 Days Later vibe. It has this, to me, the vampires come across as like this 28 Days Later Danny Boyle uh, zombie fusion. To me, the vampires come across as like these, you know, crazed zombie maniacs on lots of angel dust or PCP or on or drink or after they've drinking like 30 pots of coffee. They're all like really aggressive and they're very, you know, it's brutal. The violence is brutal. And it's got, you know, in the early 2000s there was like this thing that started driving me nuts with a lot of horror films of where, you know, you had these jump scares, but then everything is edited so quickly, so you couldn't really it's hard to actually see what's happening in some action sequences. And this whole movie has this vibe of where it's all these like super quick cuts. And I'm not really a big fan of 28 Days Later. I'm not really a fan of this like presentation of zombies being like ultra aggressive, and to me it just lacks kind of the tension and the atmosphere when I see those kinds of monsters. Um, and and to me they feel it feels like they are like hybrids of like these zombie uh, vampires, very much in step with Danny Boyle's kind of approach to zombie films, which I'm not a fan of that quick cut, you know, super fast way of showing action and creature design. I'm not really a fan of that. You know, I'm much more into the slow and brooding, the slow burn, like the approach of like Lucio Fulci or even George Romero. And I wasn't a fan. I'm not a fan on the actual design and the way they presented the vampires, and because of that quick cut hyper intensity, it kind of took me out of the movie, and for me it just lacks the atmosphere. You know, when I think of vampire movies, and again, I'm a massive film fan, but it made me want to watch a film like Let the Right One In, which is a Norwegian film that came out quite a few years ago, which is one of the greatest vampire movies ever made. It made me want to watch something like that, where there's this atmosphere and there's this real tension, and it's not this like quick cut, version of a vampire on steroids. It's you're allowed to experience it, and it's even more terrifying because it has a little bit more of a slower pace or a dynamic to it. And I feel like 30 Days of Night, there isn't any of that when it comes to the monsters or the vampires. But it made me, after taking the movie out and realizing I'm not going to finish it, it made me want to watch movies like Let the Right One In, which is a total fucking masterpiece as far as a vampire movie. Or it made me want to watch Near Dark or The Lost Boys. I mean, there's so many great vampire movies out there. And to me, it's the pacing and it's the design, and because I do think like this came out in 2007, and there was this time of where horror films were relying so heavily on this on making things visually as intense as they could, where and due to like all of these quick cut edits and kind of splicing these action sequences together and trying to make everything come at you as quickly and as fast as possible when it comes to action and even creature design. And this was like part of that trend, which I don't like because it's there's it's like, to me, it's like talking loud and saying nothing. It doesn't have that command or that presence to let your imagination get into it, and it's kind of assaultive. So yeah, there it's not a bad movie, but I think it's not a great movie, and I think that there are, for me, it's definitely the thing that took me out of this movie. Really comes down to the way those things were handled, and again, it made me instantly crave to want to throw in Let the Right One In or The Lost Boys or Near Dark. Where there's really rich atmosphere and just great vampire design, and just a great thought process put into the action sequences, and not using this quick cut editing process. So yeah, I think I generally have to say, like, this movie is pretty popular. 30 Days a Night is a very popular vampire movie. I do hear it talked about a lot, and I think I have to say, I think it's super overrated. Yeah, in comparison to any of those movies I mentioned, other like fantastic vampire movies like From Dusk Till Dawn, even masterpiece. It's 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 lukewarm, if that. So yeah, there are much better films out there in the genre. So I think 30 Days of Night is given so much praise and accolades that I feel it's not really deserving of. It's not a bad movie. It's pretty good. It's pretty solid. It's got some good things. The premise is really good, but it's just poorly executed. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.